Right, good morning, grade 11. So continuing on from our lesson of last week, we are now going to be looking at the structure of the digestive system and how it performs digestion. So first of all, if you recall, I said that the digestive system is basically one long hollow tube from your mouth all the way to your anus. I did the whole hosepipe analogy, and I said that that is called an alimentary canal. Now, your alimentary canal, this long pipe, is made up of different organs. So we just need to look at the organs that make up the alimentary canal firstly. So first of all, your mouth would start up as the entry point, okay? Not your lips. Your lips don't form part of your mouth, well, don't form part of the canal. So the opening, the hollow of your mouth is the first place or the first starting point of the alimentary canal. If we then look at the tube, we then pass from the mouth through the pharynx, which is at the back of your throat, through the esophagus into this. Okay, so let me follow it here. Right, so this is esophagus into the stomach, from the stomach to the small intestine, from the small intestine to the large intestine, which is this, from the large intestine to the rectum, and then to the anus. So one long tube from the mouth, which would be here somewhere, all the way to the anus, right? And obviously then you must know the order of the organs, all right? So it's moss likes red apples. So they've cancelled pharynx because technically the pharynx is part of your throat, so part of your mouth. But moss, mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, likes large intestine, red rectum, apples, anus. All right. And then just importantly to note, from the stomach here, can you see there's a point that goes from the stomach into the small intestine. This middle part is the small intestine. And then from the small intestine into the large intestine, which starts here and then goes all the way like that. All right. You then also have what are called accessory organs. So organs that play a part in digestion, but are not part of this tube. Okay, so when I talk about this tube, this alimentary canal, please understand that this is the part through which food will move as it is being digested. There are organs that help with this process, but the food does not actually come into contact with that organ. Or with that structure, for example. Okay, so our accessory organs, your teeth are accessory organs. Think about it this way. Food does not pass through your teeth. Yes, you chew your food with your teeth, but into the hollow of your teeth, there's no food. Okay. Your tongue, right? So your tongue plays a part in chewing and forming a bolus, but your tongue actually doesn't, the food doesn't pass through your tongue. Your salivary glands produce the saliva to chew your food and form a bolus, but again, the food doesn't go into the gland itself. Then the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. I'm not going to repeat myself. All of these organs, the food does not pass through that organ or that structure, but that structure plays a part in the role of digestion. Okay, so those are all accessory organs. So if we look at digestion, and I want you to note, we're going to do digestion apart from absorption. So when we spoke about how the digestive system works, I spoke about how first the food needs to be digested, broken up into smaller parts to be able to release the nutrients. Then those nutrients are going to be passed into the bloodstream. That passing into the bloodstream is absorption. So we are going to do that in a separate lesson away from digestion. Right now, we are only looking at digestion. So please understand that I'm starting now at the mouth and I'm working all the way through, well, technically to the anus, although there's no digestion in the anus, but I'm working from one point of the alimentary canal to another point in the alimentary canal. When I start again with absorption, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. And they're happening the same time because obviously if you eat now and you eat just now again, digestion is happening, and absorption of the previously digested food is happening at the same time that digestion is happening, if that makes sense. All right, so looking at digestion, we'll start at the mouth. Okay, looking at the mouth, you have obviously a tongue that is an accessory organ. You have teeth that are accessory organs. And you have salivary glands, okay, which we cannot see in this diagram. But they produce this mucus, this saliva that you see over here. Those are your accessory glands, accessory organs that help with digestion. Now, these structures that you see over here are your tonsils. Your tonsils are part of your immune system. Your tonsils will swell up and inflame when you are exposed to any kind of bacteria or any structure that is foreign to your body, that your body wants to get rid of. Your tonsils therefore play a part in your immune system. So usually when I teach this and you are in front of me and we're face to face and we have conversations and we talk about each other like we care about each other, I would tell you that your tonsils, because they form part of your immune system, they're very important, especially for a newborn or a young baby, for immunity, because as you know that your immune system develops throughout your life. So it starts off very sort of weak and gets more developed as you get older. And so they don't actually like to remove tonsils up in the first few years of life. Some of you will have had your tonsils removed and you don't even know that you've had them removed, or your parents told you about it because you were quite young. Most people do not have their tonsils removed up until after they are 3 years old. So why I say this is personal, my son, Ashton, he was 6 months old when he had his first, he ended up in hospital. He was very sick. And he had tonsillitis and bronchopneumonia, which is pneumonia inside the bronchioles. And he ended up in hospital, and he was 6 months old. And within a year after that, he had pneumonia and bronchiolitis and bronchopneumonia and all those things another 11 times, and every time he had them he would get tonsillitis, and that is because your tonsils are part of your immune system. So therefore the tonsils would swell up, because basically what they do, if you see this in this diagram, is they swell up like little balloons. And so the bacteria, the stuff that's causing us to get sick, goes and sits inside, it gets trapped inside these spaces at the back of the tonsils. But now if the tonsils get too inflamed, they themselves become sick and or become infected, which if you've ever felt what tonsillitis feels like, it's not really very comfortable. The problem that happened with Ashton, so if you can see, this tonsil is swollen and this tonsil is swollen. So with Ashton, I'm sorry if you don't care about my child. I know that you probably don't, but this is interesting anyway. So his tonsils were so big for his age that basically when they did swell up, they swell that this whole space. So this is what you're seeing here. This space obviously is breathing space. So when you breathe, the air would go through in the space through into your mouth. Now his tonsils swole and they completely covered this space. So he essentially only had 3 millimeters of breathing space when this happened, and it would make him not be able to breathe and not be able to eat and not be able to take in any fluids. And it caused so many problems for us. So eventually when Ashton was a year and a half, a year and a half, we eventually, after being in hospital with him several times and having tried different other things to try and help him, we eventually decided to have his tonsils removed, and touch wood, he has not ever been in hospital again. Okay, so as much as your tonsils are these very, very, very useful things in immunity, if they are overstimulated, or if they are enlarged or inflamed, they can also cause further problems, and then they're only as useful as what they are not useful, if that makes sense. I, for example, who am a lot older than my son, about 10 times his age, in fact, I still have my tonsils. And funny story, because bacteria is so easily transferred, when Ashton had tonsillitis, so would I. Except obviously that I'm a lot older and my tonsils are not as big as Ashton's were, and so it was just uncomfortable for me, but I could deal with it and become healthy again. Alright, so that's useless information again. Sorry if I bored you, but I find it interesting. Anyway. Okay, so in your mouth is the opening to this alimentary canal. You have teeth and tongue and salivary glands that are going to form or going to be involved in digestion. So there's mechanical digestion in the mouth. Let's first just look at mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion will involve the actual physical activity, so the crushing and chewing of the food. That chewing, remember I said, is called mastication. So when we chew our food, it is mastication, and our teeth are performing that chewing motion. So that's why our teeth are involved in digestion. Furthermore, while we are chewing, our tongue is pushing around that food and moving that food around, and also then mixing it with the saliva. Now, when you chew food, okay, so the action of chewing and action of moving your tongue stimulates or tells your brain that you have food incoming. Okay, so even think of when you're chewing just a piece of gum. The amount of spit in your mouth increases because your brain doesn't know that it's just a piece of chewing gum. So your brain thinks that you are receiving food, and it stimulates the salivary glands to produce saliva. That saliva then is mixed into the food by your tongue while you chew. And that forms this ball of food that is called a bolus. And when you form this ball of food, you then swallow that ball of food by pushing, or your tongue pushes that ball of food into the back of your throat. So therefore, your teeth, your tongue, and your salivary glands are accessory organs. The teeth are performing mechanical digestion. The tongue is forming mechanical digestion because it's doing the mixing. The salivary glands are involved in chemical digestion because the salivary glands are releasing this saliva, the spit that we know of. And that saliva contains enzymes, and those enzymes mix with the food to break the food down. And that is therefore chemical digestion. You have 3 salivary glands that you need to know for the purposes of grade 11, and you need to know their location. So you have 3. Underneath your tongue is your sublingual gland. Then sort of at the sides of your throat, both sides, you have a submandibular gland, and then beneath your ear, you have a parotid gland. Okay, so how I remember these. If a parrot squawks, makes noise, I hear it with my ear. Okay, under my ears. Under my mandible, what is your mandible? Your bottom jaw. So under my mandible, under my jaw, there are 2 glands, one on each side of your throat, called my mandible gland, submandibular. And then again, when we talk about languages and speaking, we talk about linguistics. So lingual says tongue, speaking, language, and then sub again says underneath. So the one under my tongue, sublingual gland. All right, so those are the 3 locations of salivary glands. Those salivary glands are going to produce saliva, and that saliva will aid in chemical digestion. Now, when we look at the saliva, the enzyme that it contains is called amylase, salivary amylase. That's important. And it has a pH of 7.4, which, if you think of pH, it goes from 1 to 12. 7 is the middle, 7 is neutral. So 7.4 is really basically neutral. It just slightly alkaline, slightly more basic, right? But negligible basically. So it's tiny bit. And so therefore it's not going to do any digestion of like hectic foods, all right? It's going to only simply start to break down food. And so salivary amylase, all it can break down is starch, and also not like a lot. It only starts to break starch down. If you take a piece of bread, since you're all at home, if you remember to do this, take a piece of bread after this lesson and put it on your tongue, and just push your tongue up against your top jaw, up against your palate, and push against that piece of bread, and you will start to feel saliva that starts to enter your mouth and break, or not break down the piece of bread, but basically act on the bread. And you will taste a sort of sweetness when you do that. That is from the amylase working on the starch. Okay, so it slightly breaks down starch. So that's how saliva is involved in digestion. Saliva also acts as an antiseptic. So what is an antiseptic? It is going to keep the environment inside our mouth as clean as possible. So we wipe down things with antiseptic to wipe away bacteria and germs. So the saliva also acts in the same way within the mouth. Obviously, then the thing that we also know about saliva is that it's going to mix with the food, so it's going to make the food more moist, and it's going to allow for easier swallowing of that food. So now we've chewed our food and we've formed this bolus, and we've pushed the bolus by use of our tongue into the back of our throat, and we swallow. The bolus, the food, will then move through our pharynx, the back of our throat, down our esophagus. Now, in our esophagus, we're going to have peristalsis. So I've spoken about what peristalsis is, the rhythmic muscular alternate contractions and relaxations to move food along. So here it will show, this diagram is showing you how food is moved along the esophagus. In terms though, so there's peristalsis in the esophagus. But in terms of digestion, there is no digestion happening in the esophagus. So no further breakdown of food is happening in the esophagus. Once it has moved down the esophagus via peristalsis, it moves into the stomach. Now the stomach is a very acidic organ. It contains acid to break this food down. I just want to show you though. So we have an opening of the stomach where food will come from the esophagus, and then we have an exit point at the stomach. Food will move out of the stomach into the small intestine. So food moves into the stomach and out of the stomach. Now, to control that, so we don't want food to be able to pass back up into our esophagus or pass out into our small intestine before it's been digested. So we have, at these exits and entry points, we have what is called a sphincter. Now, those of you who know me know enough about me to know that I'm graphic and I don't mince my words, and I'm a biology teacher, and therefore I do biology as graphically as possible. So I do apologize if you're not used to me. But basically, the way that I explain a sphincter, and I really hope that if parents do end up watching this video, that they understand that this is the way I teach. But I'm very careful because it's on video now, and there's proof. But a sphincter, in any case, works like a bumhole. Okay, so your bumhole, your anus, your anal sphincter, stays shut the whole day. And suddenly, when you need to use the toilet, it opens up to then release that feces. So I'm literally sitting doing the motion, and you can't see me, but I want you to take your hand and put all your fingers, your fingertips together, all your fingers, so that you know when you like look at your friend and you say, "What's this?" and you put this in their face, and then you go, "Wah," and you open up your fingers like children, which you love to do. I want you to do that motion. I want you to close your fingers. That is when a sphincter is closed, okay? And then a sphincter can open up, and then you'd open up your fingers to release or to allow things in. Now, so your bum hole obviously works the same way, and we talk about how you nip when you're scared, or not when you're scared, when you know that you're in trouble, for example, okay, and that's all a joke. But in real life, that's how a sphincter works, okay? It's this muscular ring that stays closed, and when stimulated, it opens up. So we have two sphincters in the stomach. We have a sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach called the cardiac sphincter. Now, the reason why it's called the cardiac sphincter is where, if you look at where your stomach sits in your chest, or in your abdomen, your stomach, your cardiac sphincter sits very close to your heart. Okay, so cardiac sphincter would open up to allow food to move from the esophagus into the stomach. And then you have your pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter opens up to allow food to exit the stomach and enter the small intestine. Now, while I'm there, the small intestine is split into three parts. The first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum, which is why it's labeled duodenum here, but it should just be labeled small intestine for the purposes of where we're at right now, because I haven't actually touched on the rest with you yet. When this food enters the stomach, and this bolus in any case, and mixes with the acid that's inside the stomach, we form what is called chyme. I did speak about that in our last lesson. Right, so inside the stomach, there is chemical digestion as well as mechanical digestion. So let's just look at mechanical digestion first. The food is mixing around, okay? It's moving around to mix with these acids. That means there is mechanical digestion, and that mechanical digestion is called segmentation, right? It's a method of propulsion, a method of movement of food. So segmentation is the forward and backward movement of food that mixes it with the enzymes or the liquids in the stomach to be able to break it. So that's mechanical. Then we have chemical digestion in the stomach, and there are two main components of this digestion. The first one that I want to look at is hydrochloric acid. It's the second bullet point over here. In our stomach, we have hydrochloric acid. Now, if you know what hydrochloric acid is, it's a chemical that is corrosive. It breaks things down. If I had to mess hydrochloric acid onto my skin, it would actually start to burn into my skin because it's corrosive, okay? It's highly acidic. It has a pH of 2, so it breaks down things. And it also acts as an antiseptic in your stomach, therefore like killing off any bacteria or foreign things that enter your stomach. So obviously hydrochloric acid is going to be involved in chemical digestion. The second component inside the stomach is called gastrin. Now, gastrin is a hormone. What do hormones do? They stimulate certain actions to happen. So gastrin is a hormone which stimulates the stomach to release gastric enzymes. Now, gastric says stomach, and enzymes, so enzymes within the stomach. So gastrin is the hormone which stimulates the release of a liquid that contains gastric enzymes that will help with or aid in digestion. Now, if we look at digestion in the stomach, we're going to have, if we think of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. The majority of digestion that happens in the stomach is the digestion of protein, okay, your meat type of foods. Sorry, okay, so I want to show you just where we're coming from. If our food, so this is the pyloric sphincter essentially, okay, which would be attached to the stomach. From the stomach, the food would enter the small intestine. You can see that this is duodenum, right? It's the first part of the duodenum. You need to notice here that I have over here the liver. Okay, this structure over here has the liver. Then I have this structure over here, which is the gallbladder. And I have this spinach leaf structure over here that is called the pancreas. Each one of these structures is an accessory organ. Liver, gallbladder, pancreas, all accessory organs that are attached via a duct to the entry of the small intestine. Now remember we said if food passes through it, it's part of the alimentary canal. If it just aids in digestion without the food coming into passing through it, coming into contact with it, it is an accessory organ. So if you pretend that the stomach was drawn into this diagram, then food is passing from the stomach into the small intestine. Food is not passing into these structures, into these organs, so they are accessory organs. But they all play a part in digestion because they secrete enzymes or liquids that move into the ducts that are passed into the small intestine, which are going to be used for further digestion in the small intestine. So if we look at the pancreas, we say it has what is called a dual function. Okay, it acts as both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. It is the only organ that has a dual function. Now in grade 12, you're going to learn a lot about endocrine system. But you're going to learn about this, well, part of it again in grade 12. But you need to understand that the pancreas acts in two ways. So as I said, as an exocrine gland and as an endocrine gland. Just to tell you what the difference is very quickly. An exocrine gland releases structures through a duct. Okay, so if we go back here, you can see that the gallbladder has a duct and the pancreas has a duct attached to the small intestine, and so therefore they are exocrine glands. So in the case of the digestive system, when the pancreatic juice is moving from the pancreas into the small intestine, it is acting as an exocrine gland, right? But there's another thing that happens. Something that is an endocrine gland is a gland that secretes hormones, but directly into the bloodstream, okay, or secretes something directly into the bloodstream, so not through no duct. It's ductless. In other words, from the organ, this whatever we're talking about, in this case hormones, moves directly from that hormone into the blood. There's no channel, there's no pathway, there's no vessel through which it moves. It moves through diffusion and osmosis and all those happy things. So the pancreas acts as an endocrine gland as well. So whereas where it acts as an exocrine gland, that's because the pancreatic juice is moving through that vessel, through that duct, into the small intestine. On the other hand, however, it also acts as an endocrine gland because it secretes hormones. Those two hormones are called insulin and glucagon. And when it secretes them directly into the bloodstream. Now, please guys, this part over here, the exocrine gland part, is going to be involved in digestion, all right? When it acts as an endocrine gland, that is going to be involved in homeostasis. Homeostasis, I did speak about in the last lesson and explain to you what we're going to do. But homeostasis is the maintenance of balance. So at the end, my last video that I do with you in this topic, I will talk about homeostasis, and then I will talk about the endocrine function of the pancreas. For now, when I'm talking about digestion, I'm talking about the exocrine function of the pancreas. All right, so I've said everything in this note, and you can just go through it in your own time. And I've put it here so that you know what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to do this now in depth. Okay, it's at the end of this PowerPoint again. But basically, I'm showing you that the two hormones that we spoke about, insulin and glucagon, they are secreted by the pancreas, and they are secreted into the bloodstream to maintain blood glucose levels. Ignore. We are not doing this right now. We will do this at the end because it has nothing to do with digestion. All right. The next accessory organ that is involved in digestion is the gallbladder. Now, the gallbladder stores bile. Please, guys, it's important. It doesn't make bile. Bile is made or produced in the liver. And that bile, then, the liver cannot keep it for itself. So it's made by the liver, and then it goes and stores in the gallbladder, and the gallbladder sends it through the bile duct into the small intestine. Okay, so where the liver is involved here, that is through making bile, and the gallbladder then stores that bile that has been made. Bile, when you vomit, and eventually, and here we go back at the graphic stuff, when you are vomiting and eventually there's no more food coming out, but you get this like yellow fluid that keeps coming out, that is bile. It's this yellowish brown liquid. Or if you're sitting and you suddenly feel like you're going to vomit, and then suddenly like there's a liquid that comes into your mouth, that they call vomiting in your mouth, that is bile. Okay. Why is bile important? Bile does what we call emulsification. Now, emulsification is breaking down something to make it water soluble. So if you think of a fat, a lipid, we need to break that fat down, and it needs to be able to be absorbed or soluble in water, in the liquid that we have in our digestive system, to be able to break down the nutrients from those lipids. There are certain nutrients in lipids that we need. We do need a small amount of fat in our diet. So bile will break down those fats so that we can do digestion, or so that digestion can happen, so that we can get the necessary nutrients from those lipids. So I need you to know that bile's function is to emulsify fats. Okay. Bile also acts as an antiseptic. So if you think of saliva acts as an antiseptic, hydrochloric acid acts as an antiseptic, and bile acts as an antiseptic, and each one is in a different place in the alimentary canal. Bile also neutralizes the duodenum, neutralizes the small intestine. Now think about this, grade 11s. I said the small intestine is very acidic. I mean, I'm lying. I said the stomach is very acidic. The stomach has a built-in layer which protects it from that acid, okay? We do sometimes get what are called stomach ulcers, which means the acid has burnt into the lining of our stomach. But for the most part, our stomach is protected against the acid because of a lining. Our other organs are not. So when the food, the acid chyme, moves out of the stomach through the pyloric sphincter into the duodenum, the small intestine, that mixture, that acid chyme, is obviously very acidic and dangerous therefore to our small intestine, because our small intestine is not protected against acids. So when we are adding bile from our gallbladder into our small intestine, the bile is the opposite of acidic, so it's very basic, right? So basically it neutralizes. So if you think of if 7 is the middle ground, neutral, and we have 2 as the acid level, the pH level in the stomach, we basically on the opposite side of the acid scale. I don't know how else to say that. So therefore, we need a pH that is very, very basic, somewhere around 12, 13, to be able to neutralize that acid. So think of if I have a pH of 2 and I need a pH of 7, I'm going to add a pH of 12 to it. 12 plus 2 is 14, divided by 2 is 7, so I'm going to balance them out. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Right, so it neutralizes the acid from the stomach, and then it also is able to, this is now bile, absorb vitamins. So obviously we know that there are vitamins in our diet. We want to be able to absorb those vitamins. And if you recall from, I think it was in grade 9 that you learned this, vitamin A, D, E, and K are not water soluble. So the bile helps for these vitamins to be able to be dissolved and therefore used and absorbed in our bodies. Okay, so if we look at the small intestine, now we've done accessory organs that are involved in the small intestine or with the small intestine, but the food doesn't actually pass into them. So we're going to go from the stomach into the small intestine. Right. The small intestine is split into 3 sections. The duodenum, the first section, the jejunum, the middle, and the ileum, the last part. Okay, and unfortunately, you just have to learn those names. Duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Right. Okay, so this small intestine, I'm just going to talk about it before I talk about the adaptations. The small intestine, funny enough, you are led to believe your whole life that the stomach is where digestion happens. Funny enough, actually the majority of digestion that happens in the small intestine, because we've had the food broken down in the stomach and we've now got hydrochloric acid that has killed any germs. Now we pass it into the small intestine where it's broken down into its simplest form. If you remember from grade 10, you spoke about carbohydrates and proteins and lipids and monomers of each one, so the simplest form. We are now going to break down those food groups into their simplest form in the small intestine. We have to therefore understand how the small intestine works. So the small intestine, obviously, imagine it's a pipe, okay, it's a tube, right? So here's this pipe, this tube. We need to look at the inside of the small intestine to understand what is happening in the small intestine. So if you look, you can see all these little like projections, finger-like projections that line the inside of the small intestine. Each one of those finger-like projections is called a villus. So we talk about villi, lots of villi, finger-like projections that are inside the small intestine. If I had to cut this open at one end, so let's say we cut it right over there and laid it flat, then it would look sort of like this. There would be muscular tissue and lining with villi on the inside. Okay. And so if I look at just one of these little structures, here is one villus that I'm looking at. Okay, and we are going to talk about how villi are adapted for digestion. Later on in my next video, we're going to do again the small intestine and talk about how it is adapted for absorption. So please understand I'm splitting this now into how it is adapted for digestion and how it is adapted for absorption. They ask this a lot in tests. And sometimes it just says like name some of the adaptations of the small intestine or of the villus. But other times it is actually quite specific into looking at what is the adaptation for digestion versus what is the adaptation for absorption. Okay. what do I want to say now? Okay, so that is that. We're going to look at one villus and how it is adapted to be able to do its job of digestion. When we look at one, I will never ask you to draw this, grade 11s. You will never be expected to draw this in a test. However, labeling it is essential. Understanding the different parts of a villus is important, and you can be asked that in a test. So if we just look at the main parts quickly, if I had to, it's missing from this diagram, but I want you to note this. There are these tiny little hairs. So if you look, so there's one villus, right? And can you see there are projections again on this one villus? So there are two. There's a one villus, but you see again these hair-like projections. Remember that one villus was a hair-like projection on its own. So there. But now each hair-like projection has its own hair-like projections. Okay. We call those microvilli. So technically, you should see here along this line all these little hairs, or things that look like hairs in any case, on the epithelium, on this line. And that is microvilli. Microvilli, that it's exactly the same. It's just projections on the villus. And villi, what are they going to do? Increase surface area. Therefore, what are microvilli going to do? Increase surface area. All right. Then we look, all these little squares here are epithelial cells. Okay, and you did epithelium in grade 10, so I'm not going to go through that a lot, but it's the outer lining. All right. And some of these epithelial cells have goblet cells. So there's a cell with a goblet cell, for example, and you did goblet cells in grade 10 as well. Okay, then we have a vessel that travels up into this villus called a lacteal. A lacteal is what is going to transport the digested fats away from the small intestine. That lacteal, so this in the middle here, joins up to a lymph vessel. You did the lymph in grade 10. Remember that your lymphatic system transports fats. So the lacteal is going to join to the lymphatic system, to lymph vessels, to carry the fats. Remember that we don't want fats to be carried in our blood. So we're going to do something else with them, and therefore we don't want them to be carried into arteries and veins. That's why we have this lacteal that carries them into the lymph vessels. Okay. We then have this network of capillaries that you can see here that are joined. Capillaries, remember, arteries and veins that join together. So we're going to have arteries and veins. What is happening with those arteries and veins? They come from the heart, obviously, and the arteries carry blood to the villus to perform its function, because it'll provide it with the necessary oxygen to do what it needs to do. And then the veins will carry it away from the villus to the heart to send back whatever. Okay, in this case, it won't go directly to the heart. Remember, we spoke about the hepatic portal system, but basically eventually the absorbed substances will then end up back at the heart. So basically we're going to have this villus that then through osmosis and diffusion, the substances move into either the lacteal if it's fat, or into the capillary network if it's the other two, proteins and carbohydrates. All right. So if we look at how this villus, one villus, is adapted to perform its function of digestion. First of all, it's folded, right? So it's got all these folds. It says it's got folds of the mucosa. So it's saying that the mucosa, the layer, the lining of the small intestine, is folded. And it has villi to increase surface area. So the first thing they're increasing surface area. Why is increasing surface area important for digestion? the more surface area I have, the more digestion can happen. Therefore, more efficient digestion is happening. Okay. The second thing talks about columnar epithelium. Remember I said it's lined with epithelial cells. So there's the epithelial cells. Columnar epithelium, you learned about columnar last year. So columnar says that it sort of looks like a column. It looks like a rod. It lines the small intestine. And on its surface, it has microvilli. Remember I spoke about microvilli? The little hairs, which are going to increase the surface area. So microvilli will increase the surface area. Columnar epithelium is going to be involved in, or be the lining, basically, of this villus. Okay. The columnar epithelium, remember, also contains goblet cells. And goblet cells will make it more moist. Okay, but goblet cells we're going to talk about more when it comes to absorption. The next, the third adaptation is that the small intestine has, or the villus, has what are called crypts of Lieberkühn. Now, crypts of Lieberkühn, every time there's this like space between a villus, that is a crypt of Lieberkühn. Okay? And what it does is it secretes juices, intestinal juices. Those intestinal juices we refer to as Succus intericus. Succus intericus contains digestive enzymes that will break down food. So, crypts of Lieberkühn produce Succus intericus, which contains digestive enzymes, which is going to aid in digestion. And then lastly, it's not depicted here, and you don't need to be able to recognize where, but at certain points there are glands within the villus called Brunner's glands that secrete mucus. And that mucus is important in neutralizing the acid chyme. Okay, so we already spoke about bile. Bile is made by the liver, secreted by the gallbladder. But in itself, the small intestine also helps to neutralize acid chyme because of the mucus produced by Brunner's glands. So those four are the adaptations of the small intestine for digestion. Now I'm going to give you a little hint here. 1, know how to label a villus. Okay, remember to add the little hair-like projections called microvilli. That's 1. That's NB, NB, NB. 2, learn at least 3 adaptations for digestion and 3 adaptations for absorption. Okay, then you are sort of safe in answering either one if you get a question about the 2 different digestion and versus absorption. Most of the time, if you get asked it, wouldn't be too specific as to which one falls where. But my suggestion would be no 3. One of them that you always guess, villi, increase surface area. Always, 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 always. All right. Right, so if we look at digestion in the small intestine, I spoke about Succus intericus. Right, so Succus intericus is the juice that is then produced by the small intestine. It is secreted by the crypts of Lieberkühn that is found between the villi. Remember I said the space between each villi. The Succus intericus contains enzymes that digest food. And it digests the food into its simplest form. So carbohydrates will have, by the end of being in the small intestine, been broken down into glucose, or not always necessarily glucose, but forms of sugar, so maltose, sucrose, etc. It'll also be involved in the breakdown of proteins. Proteins are going to be broken down into 3 fatty acids, and then your fats, your lipids, it's going to break them down, but by the aid of bile. to emulsify those fats. All right. Then we spoke about another secretion of the small intestine in the previous slide, which is mucus. That mucus is secreted by the Brunner's glands, and that mucus neutralizes, or helps in any case, to neutralize acid chyme. And then the last one, and this is not a secretion of the small intestine, but it's a secretion that is secreted via the pancreatic duct into the small intestine by the pancreas, which is called pancreatic juice. And pancreatic juice, remember I said to you, is part of the exocrine function of the pancreas, and it's going to help with the digestion of starch. Please now look at, or please note that by the end of the small intestine, we have carbohydrates that have been broken down into their simplest form, their monomer, glucose, or simple sugars. We have proteins, which have been broken down into their simplest form, 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. And we have lipids, which have been broken down into their simplest form, which is, did you even hear me? I hope that somebody picked up that this teacher was talking nonsense. Start again. Carbohydrates have been broken down into their monomer, which is glucose or simple sugars. Lipids, fats, which have been broken down into 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. Lipids, not proteins. And proteins, which have been broken down into their simplest form, their monomer, amino acids. Please, 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 please get that right. I'm repeating it because I'm not having recorded this whole lesson to just have to restart it again. Carbohydrates broken down into simple sugars such as glucose. Proteins broken down into amino acids, and lipids broken down into 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. And by the way, while I'm there, the 3 fatty acids are what will be transported by the lacteal, and the amino acids and the glucose and the glycerol will be transported by the capillary network. All right, so as I said, by the end of getting to the small intestine, we have now broken down, we have digested food completely. Therefore, that is the end. Remember I said at the beginning of this lesson, we would have from one starting point to a certain point in the alimentary canal. Digestion ends at the small intestine. After the small intestine, there is no further digestion. Okay, what's going to further happen now is that those nutrients, or that this whatever has been digested, will pass through. First of all, the nutrients that have been digested will be absorbed into the bloodstream. Whatever else is left will then move through the large intestine, where there will be further absorption, and then obviously defecation. So I'm going to end this lesson there, and next time we will talk about absorption. Have a lovely day, grade 11s. Good luck with studying.